Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Tom.
It's day 2 of our writing unit, and we're talking about something we call a metaphor. A metaphor is something you can use to make your writing a little bit more interesting. You can spice something up, your writing, with a metaphor or two. Don't go overboard with the metaphors or the similes. We're going to talk about that too. But it can make your writing a little bit more interesting, more creative. It's a technique you can use. We talked about what it is in day 1. It's when you're comparing two very dissimilar things together and you are not using as or like. If you use as or like love is like a rose, that is a simile. That is not a metaphor. A metaphor is just straight. So, love is a rose. That's a metaphor. See the difference? It's a small difference, but we like to say that they're two different techniques in writing. So, the one that we shared with you that's probably one of the most famous metaphors in the world is from William Shakespeare in his comedy As You Like It. And he said, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. That's a very famous metaphor. Today we're going to continue talking about why you might want to use a metaphor.
Okay, so let's get to it, everybody. Let's read the entire contents of today's lesson, and we'll be right back.
Using metaphors is beneficial for several reasons. For one thing, metaphors beautify our prose and poetry, allowing us to create compelling images that delight our readers. For another, metaphors can express complicated ideas in a way that makes them easier to comprehend. Instead of spending paragraphs trying to explain love, a writer can describe love with a metaphor, such as this one by Paulo Coelho. Love is a disease no one wants to get rid of. However, there are some things to remember when it comes to metaphors. First, don't overdo them. A passage containing endless, elaborate metaphors will be hard to read. Using too many metaphors also ruins their overall effect. Second, don't mix metaphors by using unrelated images, as this will seem illogical. Here's a mixed metaphor. Helen was a bright light, and the men she attracted were thirsty travelers, desperate for a drink. Readers will find this sentence strange. However, if the men are described as moths drawn to a candle, the metaphor makes sense. It's also important to avoid cliches. These are metaphors and similes that are so overused that they make a writer seem lacking in creativity, such as calling two similar people two peas in a pod. For this reason, it's a good idea to reject the first metaphor you think of when writing, as it's likely to be too obvious or even a cliché. Take the time to think about what you want to say, and you can devise a metaphor that makes your writing more imaginative. Finally, try reading poetry to absorb all the metaphors and imagery poets use. Whatever you do, have fun writing.
Okay, everybody, we're talking about spicing up your writing with metaphors. Hey, you don't actually put spices on your typewriter to produce some interesting writing. That's a metaphor there to spice up your writing. It just means to use colorful language and things like that. That will make your readers interested in what you're saying. So, yeah, you want to use metaphors in your writing, but today, as we're going to find out, you don't want to overdo it. You do want to use some, but yeah, don't go overboard with it or your readers will probably lose interest. So yeah, using metaphors is beneficial for several reasons. So if something is beneficial, that means it helps out. It creates some advantages. and it can help you achieve your results. So yes, it's beneficial for several reasons. It's good, it's helpful for many reasons. And for one thing, metaphors beautify our prose and poetry, allowing us to create compelling images that delight our readers. Yeah, we need this stuff for poetry. You know, if we don't have metaphors and things like that in poetry, why would we read it in the first place? It would just be prose then. So yeah, poetry does need metaphors, and prose does as well. Prose, of course, is just straight writing, and poetry is when you have rhythm and rhymes and things like that.
Yeah, it's a little more interesting. It actually does help you improve your writing a lot if you read poetry. That's a really good tip from our writer here. So it is beneficial for a lot of reasons. To beautify. I love that verb, to beautify something. If you do use metaphors, it does allow you to create more compelling images that delight your readers. If you write something that's compelling or you see something that's compelling, it just means it really stirs up the interest and enthusiasm in you. It can make you admire what you're looking at or really grab your attention. So if something's compelling, that's a good thing. Now, here's another beneficial reason. Metaphors can express complicated ideas in a way that makes them easier to comprehend or understand. Now, if you're talking about something that's complicated, it usually is more difficult to understand. There are a lot of details to it or parts to it, and you have to think a lot longer about it before you understand something. Some ideas in science, especially physics, I think those are very complicated ideas, and you have to take more time to think about it. Whereas if someone is talking to me about, I don't know, cooking some cookies, it's a lot easier to understand. It's not so complicated. So, yeah, metaphors can help express really complicated things, but make it easier for people to understand because remember, you're comparing them to something else. Even though that other thing is dissimilar, they might, understand a lot more about what you're trying to say by knowing what that second thing is that you're comparing it to, like the world is a stage. Oh, I understand that. You understand what a stage is and actors on a stage. So, yeah, it can really help if you can use a comparison within a metaphor. It can help your readers understand what you're trying to express.
Exactly. So, yeah, in another way of saying this, or in a nutshell, basically you're just trying to describe something complex in a simple way. For example, I know at a company I used to work for, the boss had a really hot temper. He would get mad really easily, and sometimes in order to describe his temper to somebody else who had not seen him, well, we had to use all sorts of different words and phrases and stuff like that. But when I just said, hey, he's got a temper like a volcano. Of course, that's a simile because I used the word like there, but I could say, oh, he's a real volcano today. And then you get the idea. A volcano, of course, erupts, it blows up. So that is a good way to describe the boss's temper. He's a volcano. He's really blowing up today. There's lava all over the office this morning. Okay, so yeah, that's a way to express complicated ideas in a simple way, and so you can understand or comprehend them. And instead of spending paragraphs trying to explain love or hatred or anger, a writer can describe love with a metaphor, such as this one by Paul Coelho. Love is a disease no one wants to get rid of. Ooh. That does sound so true, doesn't it?
I love that line. I think it's great. Yeah, it is. It's like you have a disease. It changes the way you feel inside. A lot of times other people around you don't understand why you're reacting or acting the way you are, but it feels so good. Why would you ever want a cure? Because being in love is great. Everyone knows that. That's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, but being sick is not great.
Oh, yeah, but it is almost like you're sick. It changes the way you feel about things and you see things. But for me, it seems like it's all pretty positive. So it's kind of funny. Maybe Paulo Coelho had a bad experience with love, too. We don't know. That could explain why he came up with this. Now, moving on to the next paragraph, it says, however, there are some things to remember when it comes to metaphors. Now, I mentioned the first thing in the open to the program. I said, don't go overboard on this stuff. To go overboard, it's a phrase we use when someone's doing too much of something. You know, it's too cool fun. So to go overboard means you're on a boat and you're thrown overboard or you jump overboard into the ocean and you're drowning. There's just too much water. So don't go overboard. Now, our writer here has another way to express that. He says, don't overdo them. If you overdo something, you do too much of it or it's exaggerated. For example, you might love to go to the gym and lift weights. But if you overdo it, you walk away the next day in pain. All of your muscles hurt. You're sore. So don't overdo metaphors. That's number one. You should always remember that.
Right. Or if somebody tells you to apologize to somebody, you could say, yeah, but don't overdo it. Just say you're sorry and sound sincere. If you just keep going on and on about how sorry you are, eventually they're going to get sick of you and they won't believe that you're really sorry. So yeah, don't overdo it. Do it just right there. So with metaphors, yeah, you don't want to use too many of them. Don't overdo it. And a passage containing endless elaborate metaphors will be hard to read. Yeah, of course, a lot of times we can't resist the temptation to show off our language skills. I think people told me this before when I used to write Chinese essays. I used too many chengyu, too many phrases. They thought, yeah, it's nice. It's pretty cool that you know those and it's very impressive, but you're overdoing it, okay? You just need to use one or two. If you use too many of them, it just looks like you're showing off.
It does. It's irritating, too. Don't do that. It's probably a good time to take a quick break, right? We're going to take a break, listen to our Chinese teacher, who never overdoes anything. And then we'll be right back.
谢谢美语老师。Hello, my name is Shelby. 今天继续来了解隐喻 metaphor。第一段就直接点出好几个使用隐喻的理由。第一句说用隐喻法有好几个理由。For one thing, for another， 这两个转折语搭配使用，引出某事的理由。For one thing 加第一个理由，再接着 for another 写第二个理由。第一个理由，隐喻法美化我们的散文和诗 ，allowing us to create compelling images， 允许我们去创造引人入胜的意象。Allowing 是省略连接词 and allow 加 ing 的分词构句，允许某人做某事。Compelling 强制的或引人入胜的。第二个理由，隐喻法表达复杂的想法，用让读者比较简单了解的方式。句子中最后一个生字 comprehend 是理解、了解。第四句，与其花篇幅来解释爱情，保罗·科尔赫直接说，爱是一种没有人想治好的病。句首 instead of 表示代替……介绍相似片语还有 in place of place P-L-A-C-E 或者 in preference of preference P-R-E-F-E-R-E-N-C-E。 保罗·科尔赫是当代的影响家，写过《牧羊少年奇幻之旅》等书，省思生命或真爱等。第二段 however 有几件事要记得，当提到隐喻时When it comes to something 表示一说到什么，直白一点就是 speaking of something。例如一说到环境污染 When it comes to pollution 或者 speaking of pollution。下一句，首先不要过度使用 overdo 把什么做得过分。英文中常用 over 再加一个动词，再加受词，表达 A 比 B 过度怎么样。Overdo 把什么做得过火，这里的 theme 就是指 metaphors 隐喻。
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Okay, let's continue with our lesson for today. We are talking about metaphors and how to spice up your writing using metaphors. As we did mention in our last program, metaphors are common in speech, yes, but they're more common in writing, especially in prose and poetry. But where we left off, we were kind of trying to warn you, don't overdo them, okay? It's nice to use one here and there, but if you use too many of them, people will think you're being pretentious or you're showing off or something like that, and they'll lose interest in what you're trying to say. So yeah, learn to use them just like you would use Chengyu in Chinese. You don't overuse those either, do you? You just pull them out every other sentence or so, and that's enough. So yeah, you don't want to have a sentence with endless, elaborate metaphors. That would be difficult to read. And using too many metaphors also ruins their overall effect. Overall just means the general effect they have. So yeah, if you've used a nice metaphor, kind of let it sit there for a while and don't let it compete with other metaphors. Let people sort of think about that one for a while instead of distracting it with another one too soon.
Looking at this one vocabulary word, overall, I just wanted to give another example here. Maybe you go to a party and someone says, "Oh, how was the party?" You could say, "Oh, the food was delicious." Yeah, overall, it was a really good party. Yeah, or you could say, "Well, the food was good, the music was okay, but, overall, it was pretty fun." So there are lots of different elements to a party, as you know. Who goes, the food, the music, lots of different things. Overall just means if you take everything into account. You could say, "Yeah, overall, it was pretty good." So that's your summation or the experience you have. You kind of sum it up with that one opinion at the end. Overall, it was pretty good. Now, here it says second, you should never mix metaphors by using unrelated images. This one makes me laugh because they will seem illogical. Or if you say something's illogical, it just means it won't make sense. It'll sound silly or kind of dumb or stupid. It just doesn't make sense. Here's one that's pretty good. Helen was a bright light, and the men she attracted were thirsty travelers desperate for a drink. Well, light and being thirsty, needing a drink, have nothing in common. Do not use those. Now, what the writer should have written was, Helen was a bright light, and the men she attracted were like moths drawn to a candle. Because moths, those little bugs that are drawn to the light. He was saying, the men were like those moths. They were drawn to Helen because she was a bright light. That is a good metaphor. But the one that mixes the light with being thirsty and needing a drink, that's a bad one. Very illogical.
I've thought of another one here.
Okay.
We could say that, the traffic in Taipei is terrible. The government needs to iron out all those traffic bottlenecks. Okay, iron out and bottleneck are not related. A bottleneck is, of course, inside a bottle, and ironing something out is flattening a piece of cloth so it looks good. So you wouldn't use those two things together. That's a mixed metaphor. You would probably say to iron out our problems or to...
iron out the wrinkles.
Yeah, iron out the wrinkles or maybe clear up the bottleneck or something like that. But you don't want to mix those things up. So yeah, you have to know exactly what you're doing there.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of years of experience and practice. Otherwise, you sound kind of dumb, if you don't know how to use your metaphors correctly. Although sometimes you can sound actually pretty funny if you use them wrongly and everybody else knows you've used it incorrectly and they think it's funny and they laugh at you and you laugh with them. It can be something to do at a party, but yeah, you don't want to do it in your writing. You're supposed to know what you're talking about. So that's an example here. Helen was a bright light and the travelers were thirsty. Yeah, those things just don't work together. So yeah, readers will find this sentence strange. And as you said, if the men are described as moths drawn to a candle, then the metaphor makes sense because a candle is a bright light. So yeah, therefore it works together. Now let's move on to the next paragraph here. It says, it's also important to avoid Cliches. Okay, that's kind of a special word there, cliche. It's kind of difficult to pronounce there, but basically a cliche is something that is said often and, in fact, is probably said too often, and you probably shouldn't say it anymore like, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Well, we've heard that since we were kids. We wouldn't really say that as adults because it's really cliche. It's used too much, and it sounds kind of childish.
Now, these are metaphors and similes that are overused, as Tom said, and they make it sound like the writer just isn't very creative, or here it says seems to be lacking in creativity. If you are creative or you have creativity within you, you're very imaginative. You come up with new ideas, new things, new thoughts. Here's a really bad cliche. It's 2 peas in a pod. 2 peas in a pod is when you describe people who are very similar. But that's used way too much, guys. For this reason, it's a good idea to reject the first metaphor that comes to mind when you're writing. Think about it a little longer and see if you can come up with something that's really creative and something you haven't heard before. But I also want to say before you do put it in your writing, check with a friend and see if it makes sense. Because sometimes, you'll think it's really new and creative, and then you'll share it with somebody, to see what they think, and they won't understand it. Maybe it's not the creative metaphor that you thought it was.
And you're not as clever as you thought you were, so yeah, run it past somebody else, a native speaker or something, to make sure it sounds okay. And make sure it does not sound cliche, like 2 peas in a pod, or, it's raining cats and dogs outside. We've heard that quite a bit, and we probably should think of other ways to describe pouring rain outside. And for this reason, it's a good idea to reject the first metaphor you think of when writing, as it's likely to be too obvious or even a cliche. So yeah, when you're writing something and then you think, okay, here's the metaphor I'm going to use, but, the rule says don't use the first one you think of because it's probably going to be too cliche. Because everybody else has probably thought of that too. And so if you use that, they're going to think, you didn't really think hard enough to come up with a new metaphor yourself. You're just using an old cliche, and so you might lose your credibility and they will lose interest in reading your essay.
They sure will. So here's really a good piece of advice. Take the time to think about what you want to say. And then what you can do is you can devise a metaphor that makes your writing more imaginative, more creative. If you devise something, guys, it's a verb that means you're coming up with a plan, or so you're planning something, you're inventing something. But when you devise something, it's usually something that's kind of complex. You might be devising a new system for your company. You might be devising a new procedure that they're going to use. You're devising something, but it only comes through very careful thought. It's not something that just pops into your head. So take some time to devise a good metaphor that sounds great. And finally, here's the last piece of advice. Try reading poetry to absorb all the metaphors and the imagery poets use. They do like to paint a beautiful picture with words in poems. So that's a great piece of advice. But finally, whatever you do, whatever you choose to do, have fun writing. Writing should be fun and not be a chore or a bad piece of work that you've been assigned to do.
Yep, writing should be enjoyable, and also reading poetry can help you come up with some metaphors, or at least see some examples of metaphors.
Yeah.
And then you can use your imagination and come up with some new ones that no one else has thought of. And we wish you the best of luck in that. I'm very confident that all of you can write really wonderful and interesting essays as a result. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation. It's time now to listen to our Chinese teacher.
Second, 第二，别混用不相关的隐喻。举了个混合的例子。第5句的地方 ，Helen 是一盏明灯，被她吸引的人像饥渴的旅人，热切的解渴。引言的后面 ，be desperate for something 是热切的渴望某物 ，desperate for a drink 就是要渴望饮水。会觉得很奇怪，如果把人描述成扑向烛火的飞蛾，那么这个隐喻就合理了。 第7句中 Moths drawn to a candle. Moth 飞蛾 Draw 吸引或拉，它的三态是 draw, drew, drawn， 这里用 PP 后位修饰，表达被吸引。前面呢，将女生比喻成一盏明灯，被吸引的人却渴望水，两个比喻是矛盾的。灯应该是吸引飞蛾，用飞蛾扑火，才可以清楚勾勒这凤求凰的意象。最后一段，第一句说，很重要，避开用陈腔滥调，是一个 it is 形容词，再加 for somebody， 再加 to v 的句型。对某人来说，做什么事情是怎么样子的。it 是虚主词，形容词用来形容事情，而不是形容人。那这类的形容词我们常见的可能有 important, difficult, necessary 或者 easy 等。Cliché 上面有一撇，这个字呢是出自法文，是指陈腔滥调的事物。英文的意思呢有点接近 corny, C-O-R-N-Y 这个字。Cliché ideas 就是陈腔滥调的点子。第二句，这是一些如此被过度使用的隐喻，以至于他们会让作者看似缺乏创意。例如，叫两个很像的人是豆荚里的两颗豌豆。That 所引导的形容词子句中有个句型 so overused that 如此怎么样以至于 make a writer seem lacking in creativity。 Make 实义动词，后面呢动词 seem 含有主动成分，所以用原形。Lacking 缺乏，in something 表示在哪方面。英语谚语中形容两个很像的人，可以用例如像 twin 双胞胎 Joe and Josh look like twins， 或者 a dead ringer dead D-E-A-D 当完全的 total 的意思。 Ringer R-I-N-G-E-R 是指长相酷似某人的人，但最常见的还是莫过于 two peas in a pod。 pea 豌豆， pod 是豆荚。第三句，因此呢，这是一个不错的想法，去拒绝第一个浮现的隐喻，因为它可能太平淡无奇。后半段 It is likely to be too obvious。 Likely 可能的是一个很好用的字，因为它变化多，加一个 un 在前，变成 unlikely， 加 quite、most 等，又加强其语气。Not likely 意思是不行。最后一句，花时间想一想你想写什么 Whatever you do 相当于 No matter what you do。 以上是今天的讲解，谢谢收听。
That's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and make sure you join us again next time for another edition of our program. Until then, we look forward to seeing you. From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Bye.
See ya.